Yes. Welcome. Come in, please, take a seat. There is a space for everyone today. What we are going over today on Tuesday, which is the reset for NA, and tomorrow it's gonna be for EU. The reason why we are making a video today is because this is the start, or soon to be the start of the last week before 9.1.5 drops. Now, we already gone over the problems of the release of this patch. I guess the staggered release with the big focus of the patch being delayed basically by a month. The reason why we still have to talk about this is the fact that this is basically going to be the last reset, the last weekly reset of Mythic Plus, of raiding, before several specs are going to be able to freely respec to multiple covenants, and several specs are going to be able to get some, if not all, of their abilities removed from the target cap. So we can take essentially a time capsule of today, of the last week of this patch, this version of the game, right before a lot of things are going to change in just a week. I already pointed out the first time we heard about the news that Blizzard was finally allowing you to freely respec covenants, that this could have actually been a buff or an indirect nerf to certain specs. The reason for this is because right now there can be quite a few specs that can perform better in the raid as a certain covenant, or better in Mythic Plus as a certain covenant, but unfortunately they can't freely respec. So they have to choose. They have to make a decision. Apparently this was also what Blizzard would have hoped or thought. It would have played a lot in your feeling of playing an RPG, whereas in reality it just made you more frustrated. However, that's another point. The actual point is that, for example, you have specs like Shaman. Restoration usually plays Necrolord in raids, but it's going to be much more effective as a Kyrian in Mythic Plus. Prot Paladins are better as Ventir in raids, but they are also much better as a Kyrian in Mythic Plus. So once the patch drops, the part where I say some specs are going to be buffed is because you will be able to see several specs being able to finally play in their best possible covenant for each and every type of activity. So it is going to be a buff to them, because right now you might have made yourself an idea of how strong a spec is in Mythic Plus, or perhaps in raids, or even in PvP, but this is without counting for the fact that perhaps there are many players playing with not the optimal covenant for that activity, which is not gonna happen in 9.1.5 because you will have no restriction. Given a few days if you're fast, or a couple of weeks if you're a little bit slower, to bring up your renown for your other covenants, you will be able to be at the same level of your current main covenant. So it's going to be a buff for these specs that can benefit from this multi-switching of covenants. It might even be a buff for a class as a whole. Take Mage, for example. You're playing Frost, you are Ventir. You are playing Arcane, you are Kyrian. You are playing Fire, you are Nightfey. Up to this point, you pretty much had to make one choice, which of the specs you want to play for the tier. That's it. Now, in just a week, you're going to be able to play all three specs at the same time. And as I am saying that this can be a buff to these classes and specs that are going to benefit from this, I also said it is obviously going to be an indirect nerf to the other ones, to the other classes and specs that are not really gonna benefit anything from this. So their competitors essentially are going to be able to benefit from this, but they won't. One of the decent examples is Warlocks. Pretty much at the moment all Warlocks are playing Nightfey, and it's likely that they're gonna stay Nightfey even as this happens. Or a Holy Paladin, which is basically perma stuck as a Ventir Holy Paladin. It's not really gonna change much for him if you can now spec to multiple covenants. Same goes for a Hunter who was remaining Nightfey, etc, etc. So this is going to be the last week where we are going to have all of the classes stuck in a single covenant, and after that we will be able to see a few changes, perhaps even in the meta, perhaps even which specs are going to be played more, because at the moment the prospect of trying out a different spec required you to grind quite a lot. to change Covenant, whereas in just a week it's going to be lifted, this restriction. The other thing that is going to further increase the possibility for these changes is going to be the removal of the AOE cap, the target cap, for several of these specs. And here we are in the same situation of the Covenants, because just like some specs and some classes are going to be able to benefit from playing multiple Covenants, whereas others not really, because they are likely going to be playing a single Covenant anyways, the AOE cap is only going to benefit certain specs, not everyone. It's not that currently every spec is doing less AOE damage than they could because they have some AOE abilities fixed on a target cap, and in just about a week they're going to be suddenly be able to AOE much more. This AOE cap lifting is not going to affect every single spec. Some specs are going to benefit more than others. So today we are going to take a look for this time capsule that we will save for the future at Mythic Plus. The last time we went over Mythic Plus was 19 days ago, I think, so almost 3 weeks ago. We're gonna take a final look at this patch and how it's been. Also, interestingly enough, now we have gotten enough keys pushed at high level that we can also filter all of the keys for being higher than plus 25. So now you get to see the real top end. Before we were stopping just at plus 20. We can also compare this to the average player base, everyone playing keys from plus 5 to plus 14, and then as well, of course, the middle of the pack, the majority trying to reach plus 15 or that range of keys. Unsurprisingly, as something that we have seen for the last few, at this point, months, I guess, is that Guardian Druid is the most popular tank when it comes to very high keys, plus 25 and up. I still stand by the fact that this has been one of the better tiers as a whole. In fact, if you want to be broad, it's been a pretty good expansion as a whole, but this tier in particular has been pretty good to tanks, to their diversity. Guardian Druid has the definite advantage when it comes to the very high keys. When you look at the middle of the pack, you see a much more even and broad balance amongst all tanks. Guardian still retains the majority of the popularity, but now it's much closer to other specs like Vengeance and like Protection Paladin. Protection Paladin, which remains, again, for reasons unknown, perhaps many people find it entertaining, remains one of the more popular tank specs in Mythic Plus and in raids, despite not being the meta tank of choice in either of these two activities. Is still very, very popular. Nothing particular is happening to tanks when it comes to balance and when it comes to being able to play multiple Covenants and whatnot. The only one slightly that we can say that we touched on before is the fact that for many of the prot paladins that are raiding, they generally wanted to be Ventier because of the power of Ashen Hallow as a cooldown to be used in the raid environment, and then they had to suffer a little bit more in Mythic Plus because they had to be Ventier. But now, in a week, you will be able to have your prot paladins, even the raiders, go back to Kyrian in Mythic Plus. So this might also make them a little bit better in terms of their performance, what they can do in Mythic Plus. Not really too much for the other specs, especially the popular ones like Guardian, who is gonna stay Night Fae, or Vengeance, who is gonna stay Kyrian. So it's not gonna change too much for the other tank specs. When you go over to healers, again, this has a similar connotation to what we talked about the tanks and the possible change to Paladin for protection. In this case, it's Restoration Shaman. So the very high keys, unsurprisingly, they are not in as good of a state as tanks. Because when you have, when you have 82%, almost 83% of all of the healers in the very high keys being just from 2 specs, it shows a pretty heavy dominance, especially when you look at the others. There isn't even a third prominent spec. All of the other specs outside of Resto Shaman and Holy Paladin have been eaten, essentially, in the very high keys. They still retain, of course, their good and strong popularity in the more large version of this graph for plus 15 keys, even though here we go and see something similar we have seen with Prot Paladin for tanks. Prot Paladin, while not being super meta, is super popular. The same goes for Resto Druid. So as soon as you go out of the very strict meta of very high keys, Restoration Druid is very popular. It's already popular in keys higher than 15 like here, and even, you know, more popular when you look at all of the keys. In fact, it's the second most popular of all of the healers. As I said, the main change, the main focus here is that Holy Paladin is still gonna stay Vent tier, even if you can change covenants. Resto Shaman is the one that's going to benefit from this, because Resto Shaman will be able to move over to Kyrian. So even if they were raiding as a Necrolord, now they can go over to Kyrian specifically just for Mythic Plus, which is going to give them a much stronger performance than if they were Necrolord in the dungeon. Then we have the bit about the DPS, starting first with the melee DPS. The melee DPS, so here's the thing, at the high keys, it kind of reminds you of what you have seen before already a few times. This is going to feel sort of like a deja vu, because once again, there is Havoc, Windwalker, and the Rogue specs that have been the predominant specs at the high keys. This is something that existed since Legion, by the way. You know, perhaps they wanted to celebrate the resurgence of Mythic plus Legion time walking, so this is the meta we're gonna get for that, but this is something that has happened before. For pretty much the whole existence of Mythic Plus since Legion, specs like Ret, specs like Survival, DKs, Enhancement, Feral, and Assassination, we can bump into it, have never been close to these three classes. And once again, they go up and be the most popular specs in Mythic Plus. These are just the highest keys of the highest groups. Even if we look at the, you know, the plus 15 key and higher range, Havoc is still overall the most popular, followed by Windwalker. The only reason why Rogue is so much squished down is because it's actually pretty even amongst all three specs. So basically, the three specs of Rogue are stealing each other's players away. So it looks lower, but it is still overall the more popular class compared to all of the others. The only difference compared to other tiers, the only difference compared to previous expansions and things you were used to, is that Warrior is more popular than usual, than what you would expect for Mythic Plus. That's the only bit of news related to the popularity. The other bit of news, the more important one, is that here not only are we going to see the Covenant respecking possibly affecting some of these classes and specs, we are also going to see the AOE cap come into play, because these are DPS. So where it's not going to affect too much tanks and healers, it certainly will for DPS. For example, you have Retribution Paladin, who is getting its Divine Storm lifted from the target cap. You have Spinning Crane Kick and Fist of Fury also getting lifted off of their target cap for Windwalker Monk, which was already a very popular and strong spec for their AoE burst. So this is just going to make them even stronger. Same goes for Havoc, who has gotten a handful from Fel Barrage to Glaive Tempest of abilities lifted from the AoE cap. And this is the section where we have to mention the big elephant in the room, Outlaw Rogue, which is not going to get Flurry off of the target cap. So this is going to be able to let us see just how it is going to impact Rogue, Outlaw in particular, with their AoE power compared to all of the other specs against which Outlaw basically competing for a melee DPS slot. And all of those specs, the premier ones, Havoc, Windwalker, even Arms and Fury, have gotten better AoEs, and Red Paladin, of course. Outlaw has been pretty much left behind when it comes to this help for AoE, so we will see in just a week or so how it is going to impact Outlaw in particular. Whereas, as far as Covenant respecking is concerned, this might be a little bit more helpful, not for specs that want to play with different Covenants if they are raiding or doing Mythic Plus, because most of these would play the same Covenant. This is going to help more classes as a whole, like Warrior being able to play Fury and Arms at the same time, or Rogue being able to play all three specs at the same time, because Arms, for example, is primarily just Kyrian, whereas Fury Warrior has been moving around a bit this expansion, Ventir and then Night Fae and then a little bit more Kyrian, primarily just so they can play Arms as well. With this Covenant free swapping, it's going to help Warriors, and of course it's going to help Rogues as well, because sub-Rogues are almost exclusively Vent tier, whereas Outlaw rogues are almost exclusively Necrolord, so this is going to help you play both, really swapping between them. Lastly, on this list we do have the ranged DPS. So the ranged DPS, when it comes to the highest of keys, we have gotten a pretty sad situation, at least for me, from what I'm used to. What we see is that mages and balanced druids are eating up the competition. Not as much, they're not eating it up as heavily as Holy Paladins and Resto Shamans do, because by these numbers there is still a decent representation of Elemental Shamans and Marksmanship Hunters. It's not that bad, but still, once again, we essentially have at the moment a 49% representation of mages in your Mythic Plus groups. So as we went talking about the melee DPS for how long we have seen Havoc and Rogue being the dominant specs in high keys of Mythic Plus for several years, this is not too different. This is not too much of a change compared to what we have seen, mages and balanced druids being the more popular ones. Warlocks have never been super meta in the very high keys, shamans, shadow priests, not really. The only one that's kind of disappointing compared to what they were used to is a little bit Hunter, but not even that much. Hunter has never been as high as a mage or even as a balanced druid in priority, except for a stint at the end of BFA thanks to their scaling with corruption. So this is once again in a pretty sad situation, especially because, as I predicted, or I should say as I feared, fire mages somehow once again becoming more and more popular out of nowhere. At the very least, now it is a little bit more bearable because it's not really OP. Before, fire was super popular because it was also super OP, but now, you know, it's fine if you want to play fire. It's not really that broken, so if you enjoy the spec, which is certainly more enjoyable than Frost or even Arcane, you're free to go. I'm not gonna get triggered about that. When it comes to respecking different covenants as well as the AOE cap, we have to point out, as we mentioned at the start, we have to point out the drastic difference between mages and warlocks. All three warlock specs are playing Night Fae, on top of all three warlock specs not being particularly good in Mythic Plus. And on the other side, you have three mage specs playing three different covenants. So this is going to help them quite a bit, being able to choose around which spec they want to play. It's also going to make you as a player more into the game, because it's always more interesting, it's always more enjoyable when you get to try different things, you know, freshen up your experience. So being able to just zigzag up and down, back and forth between one Mythic Plus key as Frost, go back into the raid as Fire, and then go back into another Mythic Plus key as Arcane, it's definitely going to make it feel more refreshing to play. One of the major changes when it comes to AOE cap is the fact that Beast Mastery is not going to have Beast Cleave on the AOE cap anymore, like they have had this entire expansion, which is going to be pretty important. And Elemental Shamans are not going to have their Eye of the Storm of their Storm Elemental target capped anymore. So these are the two more meaningful lifting of target caps for these range specs. It is, to close out the part about the range DPS, it is still pretty interesting to see the drastic difference between the very high keys and the bigger group, the bigger part of the population in keys higher than 15 in general, because especially the drastic rise of Fire Mage is pretty telling. They are essentially going from some 20-ish% all the way down to 5 when you look at keys in the 15 range. We do see, again, the overbearing popularity of Hunter as a class in this game. Both Marksmanship and Beast Mastery are basically fighting for the top 3 most popular specs, and they are from the same class. Elemental Shaman, we have seen the rise of this spec in AoE ever since they got buffed in 9.0.5. They have kept growing. They are now a pretty staple part of your Mythic Plus groups if you're looking for AoE and for a range specs with some good utility, so they are still pretty popular. The one that has been left a little bit more behind, especially if we compare it with the start of the expansion, is Shadow Priest, which has not kept up. To be fair, they have also gotten a little bit nerfed in their Shadow Prism Legendary. They have not really been part of high key Mythic Plus either, so they are back to the usual niche hipster pick as a range DPS. Still, every time we talk about Mythic Plus and every time we go over the range DPS, I go back to being completely confused as to why Destruction is the most popular spec for Warlocks. I have no idea. It looks awful, especially compared to Affliction, but hey, Maybe it's a case just like Fire Mage for mages, maybe there is tons of warlocks who enjoy playing Destruction, or maybe they are just nostalgic. Maybe they just want to pretend they are back to the days of 8.3 Destruction warlock back in Nyalotha. Maybe that's the reason why. So now that we are done with the range DPS, we have our time capsule to save right before this upcoming patch. This is going to be the last week on 9.1, after which we are going to see some significant changes for quite a few of the classes and specs. If not in their power, if not in how strong they're going to be, perhaps for some classes how more enjoyable it's going to be for you to be able to play them, because you're going to have the freedom to play multiple covenants. To me, the best possible scenario for you would be to have 2 to 3 playable specs, so you can juggle around the specs based on the content you can do, while at the same time also having 1 to 2 viable covenants for each of these specs. I think that's gonna be very good for your constant enjoyment of your character over time, because you can quickly and consistently change things up whenever you're trying something to keep things fresh. I think that would be the best possible scenario for you. Anyways, with that being said, we will see. We will see, because it's just a week away, so eventually, soon enough, we will see how it is going to impact all of the different classes and specs. For now, we can stop here. As usual, thank you for watching the video. If you want to support the channel or continue doing so, you can like the video, leave a comment down below. If you are at least proficient in 3 languages, you can subscribe to the channel as well. And now I take my leave. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, so I have had a big debate recently. Which one wins? Tic Tacs mint flavored or orange flavored?